world was on edge for Hong Kong over the weekend when 1.7 million people demonstrated again in defiance of the Chinese Communist Party's warnings of a military crackdown.
I think if they use the same force that they applied in Tiananmen 30 years ago, I believe it would be the beginning of the end of the CCP. I think the CCP would ultimately collapse.
The CCP backed down from its tough rhetoric around the time when American politicians rallied around the Hong Kong people and one top Chinese diplomat visited the U.S.
What was reported coming out of the meeting is that Secretary Pompeo took a very hard line that, hey, this is about freedom and democracy.
The Hong Kong protests might have complicated the U.S.-China trade talks, but the fundamental challenges regarding the trade tensions between the two countries remain the same. So my question is, do you think the CCP will really do the structural changes that the U.S. demands?
No, do not.
Without structural changes, the CCP is hanging their hopes on the new U.S. president in 2020.
Biden will not win the Democratic primary because of China.
What about the rest of the Democratic camp?
Now in the political marketplace in the United States, stopping the CCP is getting every day to be a bigger and bigger issue. And I think the Chinese Communist, Wang Qishan and Xi make a fundamental mistake if they believe that there's going to be some accommodation for them.
And what does that mean for the prospect of a trade deal?
I don't think that we will have a deal before the 2020 election.
What about after? At the height of the Hong Kong pro-democracy demonstrations and the crossroads of the U.S.-China trade talks, my interview with former White House chief strategist Steve Bannon, we discuss Hong Kong's future, what's next for the U.S.-China trade war, the stakes for all parties, and above all, the nature of this grand conflict. I'm Simone Gao, and you are watching Zooming In. All right, Mr. Bannon, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you for coming to the Breitbart Embassy, your first interview here, and it's noon on a very hot August day, so thank you. It's an older house, so thank you for bearing with us.
Thank you. Let's talk about Hong Kong. 1.7 million people took to the street in Hong Kong over the weekend again. The PLA, the Chinese military garrison, kept quiet. Meanwhile, one of the surrogates of the CCP in Hong Kong assured the world that the martial law would not be declared in Hong Kong, and the smearing of the national emblem by the protesters is just a small incident, not a big deal. So obviously the CCP is backing down from its tough rhetoric compared to just a few days ago. What happened?
Well, I think the rhetoric from the West is getting increasingly tougher. I mean, last week is I have said throughout that we're in Washington, D.C., and I've been telling the political elites in D.C., the thing that pulls in a very divided country, because the United States, we're very divided on many topics. The one topic that unites everybody is the Hong Kong protest. Everybody in this country has basically come together. The political elites and the people, some of the business interests that are in business with the CCP, no, but everybody else has come together. Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, McCarthy, Marco Rubio, the president, they're all united in saying and telling the CCP, putting them on notice that this is not acceptable, particularly the police brutality of last week, highlighted by the young woman that had her eye put out by the rubber bullet. Everybody's standing in solidarity. Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the UK, if you look at his statements from the moment he took over as UK, which were horrible. We want to cut a deal with the CCP, I'm going to go to China, to now he's actually standing up and saying, hey, the 1984 agreement must be completely in place, just like we had in 1997. All those attributes have to be upheld. You've seen a shifting in world opinion, and that is because of the brutality of the police forces and also the arrogance of the Chinese Communist Party, putting soldiers on the border, having Carrie Lam say you're on an abyss. So I think the height, it raised up to a level that the world came together, and I think the CCP is the one that's backed down. I think President Xi don't have a thought-through plan. They would clearly like to go in and do a brutal put-down of this, because they don't want this contagion to spread to mainland China.
That's your estimation. They definitely wanted to move in, have a bloody crackdown on the protesters.
I think there's aspects, not all. I think there are different factions in the CCP. There's just like in Tiananmen back in '89, there are different factions.
What about Xi?
There's certain faction. I think Xi is torn. He leans more, I think, to the crackdown phase of the Wan Xishan and some of the hardliners who want to go in and show complete dominance of remember, they're the ones in back of the extradition treaty. The extradition treaty, and this is why the young kids in Hong Kong were so smart. The extradition treaty is just a final step in taking back all your rights, being able to send you to China to basically be put into prison, not even have the rule of law. So the hardliners that are in back of pushing this extradition treaty are the same ones I think that want to go in and have a put down of this to show the world they're in charge, and particularly to show mainland China they're involved. One of the great tells in this entire thing is that normally the CCP will have protest in mainland China to show the support. They've had protests now in Europe, they've had protests in Australia, they've had protests in Canada. They will not allow a protest in mainland China, and the reason is I think they're afraid of the contagion of freedom even spreading there. So I think there's definitely a hardline faction. I don't think that Xi has a thought-through strategy. I think President Trump continues to disrupt that. Trump said, hey, let's have a personal meeting. And then he said the other night, I think on Saturday, why don't you go to Hong Kong and sit down with the protesters? You could solve this in 15 minutes, right? And all this type of stuff of kind of goading Xi to take action to stop this. So I think that the West has played this very smartly. I think the protests yesterday, the 1.7 million people coming out and doing it peacefully also raises the bar, because basically those people said in the streets on Sunday, we're not backing down on this, right? We may not allow any more violence, but this thing is going to continue on, and we want the 5 demands met.
Yang Jiechi flew to the U.S. to meet with Secretary Pompeo a couple of days before the big demonstration in Hong Kong.
This is the power of the Epoch Times, and I think why you're one of the rising and most influential voices in the United States and the world on issues related to China. If you notice, the mainstream media did not cover that meeting. Is so important.
So
Yes, but I think this is why the Epoch Times is one of the reasons I agreed to do this interview. I think you guys every day are becoming more and more as one of the standards in actually reporting news that's out there on this entire conflict, and the mainstream media is playing catch up with you. You, I think, did a much better job than the mainstream media. What shocks me is that was not a bigger story. In the middle of the August holiday, when all the leaders go to the beach and they have all those senior meetings down. Yes, when in the middle of that, for him to fly to New York for one day for a meeting.
That was after the Beidaihe meeting was over.
Yes, it was over, but even to go, but that he was clearly going on instructions for him to go. Yes. And to break up a holiday, to go and literally have a sit down, and not in Washington, D.C., to actually go to New York and meet with Secretary Pompeo.
What's the point of go to New York instead of D.C.?
I think the fact that it would have been a more official visit if it had been actually, remember, he's considered in the United States to be the senior diplomat of China. I've met with him many times. And I think going to D.C. would have been too much of an official visit. So it was unofficial. That's why it was in a neutral territory like New York, which is a world financial capital. But that meeting, I think, was very important. Clearly, I think it was to send a message. One message was, if you guys come in and back the protesters, I think if you back the protesters, it's only going to get worse. I think at least what was reported coming out of the meeting is that Secretary Pompeo took a very hard line that, hey, this is about freedom and democracy. I think the biggest issue, and this is one issue that I think needs to be on the table, is this an internal matter of China or is it broader? I argue it's broader, and here's why it's broader. The turnover agreement and the agreement that the Chinese and the Hong Kong people agreed to is an international accord between the United Kingdom and China. But then we had a law passed here in the United States to support that in 1992. This is an international deal. I think Senator Marco Rubio in his tweets has laid it out the best, where he's laid out why this is an international matter and not an internal matter of the CCP. I think that was the central part of the conversation. The CCP wants this to be looked at as an internal issue, just dealing with China and its sovereignty. I think it's beyond that.
So the world, the people in Hong Kong, and I think the people in China, mainland China, are all watching for one thing. To what degree can the U.S. deter the CCP, from using massive violence against the protesters in Hong Kong? And how willing is the U.S.?
The CCP is insidious. So they're going to use every aspect to try to get control here. They've already sent in, undercover police officers, right, as informers. They've already tried to infiltrate. You can see that in some of these protests. They've sent in people as agitators to try to create violence, to try to create incidents. They will use every aspect. They're on Twitter, sending false messages on Twitter. They're doing these phony protests throughout the world. The tools they have in the toolbox to cause concern here is very high. I believe that the way the West has played this has raised the stakes, and I think this is why you see, and when I say back down, I don't mean they've all backed down. Everything they're doing is tactical right now. Mm-hmm. They've backed down, they've taken down the rhetoric for a minute, and the protesters have also, shown that they're relentless and they're not going to give up, but there wasn't any violence like there were some of these incidents that were started by the police in the Hong Kong airport, in the subways, etc. So, but I think that the CCP understands that they're on notice from the West, that in Japan and others, that the world is not prepared to accept another Tiananmen Square.
Let's talk about U.S.-China trade war. So, what is your fundamental thinking on the U.S.-China trade war? Do you think it's just about rebalancing the trade relationship between the two countries, or is it recalibration of the U.S.-China relations at large?
It's an armistice and an economic war that the Chinese Communist Party has been running against the industrial democracies for 20 or 25 years in cahoots with the global financial and corporate elites. This is an armistice. This is why the original deal that was negotiated for over a year had these 7 verticals, these verticals about the subsidies to state-owned industries, about cyber intrusions, about forced technology transfers, all these very deep technical aspects. That's why Ambassador Lighthizer and Peter Navarro negotiated with Li He and others in the Chinese negotiating team for over a year. This document is over 200 pages long and highly technical about aspects. It calls for full transparency, full accountability, and full enforceability of this deal. It won't be any more like the United States has done in the past or the West has done in the past, which is basically to agree to the lies. And let's be brutally frank here. The CCP, every time they open their mouth, they lie, okay? They've lied on every deal that they've ever set up with the West. They tell you one thing and then they do what they want to do. Trump was the first president to say, we're not going to do this, and Lighthizer is savvy enough. So you had an agreement, and that agreement basically started to bring the Chinese economy into the world economy, to get away from the slave labor that's really gone on in China and this oppression of Chinese workers. And so it was the beginning of a rapprochement, and that's why hardliners in China, and particularly hardliners after this Belt Road Initiative conference they had, where they think, the Wan Shishans in the world think that, hey, we've got the West where we want them. We got One Belt, One Road, we have Made in China 2025, and we have Huawei. The conversion of that will make us the dominant hegemon economically throughout the world. And the world's, and the way they look at it is very simple. The capitalists in the West have financed us. The corporatists give us their technology. They don't care what we do to Falun Gong. They don't care what they do to the underground Catholic Church. They don't care what we do to the Dalai Lama, the Tibetan Buddhists. These people are totally greedy, right? They've given us everything we want, and they'll back down, right? They will back down, and then we'll become the hegemon. The system will be our system. Trump was the first one to step up with that, and that's why people have to look at the original deal that was negotiated. It was negotiated for over a year. Xi and these people knew and the entire time what was going on. Li He is one of the smartest individuals, I think, in the world. He's a quite brilliant individual. It's not like he didn't keep anybody in the loop. This was agreed to on and on and on. And finally, when they realized what they were signing up for, hardline elements into the CCP said, no way. We'd rather confront the West and confront them now. And you've seen what's happened to the Chinese economy. So this war, this economic war, has 3 major aspects. Trade is only one. You have both a technology piece and a currency piece. And just this morning, as we started this interview, President Trump had been talking about basically pulling the plug on Huawei across the board. The Commerce Department just announced they're going to give them another 90-day extension. But Huawei is the technology piece. The currency piece is another. And I said 2 weeks ago on CNBC, we're passing a psychological barrier here with the Chinese Communist Party. Number one, on September 1st, before we pushed it back, 100% of the goods in China would be under tariff. That's a huge psychological barrier. Okay, that is, we've now raised that. The other was the yuan to the dollar, and I said, before it happened, 2 days before it happened, they're going to pass the 7-to-1 ratio, and that's a psychological barrier of what their support is. So we're now into, I believe, a beginning of a currency war. I believe that we're in the beginning of a technology conflict, and I believe we're being in a trade war. And I have said this to the Chinese people: the CCP cannot win these. The CCP cannot win these. The only reason this situation has gotten as bad as it's gotten is because the capitalists in the West, the Wall Street and the City of London, and certain corporatists, certain elites, what I call the Party of Davos, right, have basically financed the CCP and has allowed them to get technology. Those days are over. People in the United States particularly, there's going to be big restrictions. They're already starting to talk about big restrictions on financing the CCP from the capital markets.
I think you brought up a very important question, aspect of the trade talk. Before CCP realized what they are agreeing to, they said, oh, this is okay. Just like last year, at the end of the year, during G20 in Argentina, Xi Jinping almost agreed to everything the U.S. has put on the table, even talked about the details, but afterwards they backed off. Right. So my question is, do you think the CCP will really do the structural changes that the U.S. demands?
No, do not. And that's why I said, I've said this now for over a year. And I said it specifically in interviews at the beginning of this year. I don't think that we will have a deal before the 2020 election.
What about after?
Potentially after, if the economic situation gets tough enough. I think that they understand with Trump, and now with voices that are actually to the right of Trump. What has changed here politically is that you have Schumer as a Democrat, you have Rubio as a Republican, you have people like Tom Cotton and Ted Cruz. You have people actually getting to the right. President Trump is the big, first off, he's the hardest line president we've ever had about the CCP. But you actually have people getting to the right of him. And I think the political calculation, like I said, the one thing that has united the United States, we're not united on any other topic except one, and that's the CCP. And the CCP's brought it on themselves because the way that they've comported themselves, the way that you can't believe. People in China, remember one thing that's very important. President Obama and Biden went out of their way to accommodate the Chinese and try to get a deal. They came to, remember, Biden went to Beijing in 2013 to try to accommodate them, and we got the buildup of the islands in the South China Sea, right? Obama tried to get them to stop cyber intrusions and the stealing of intellectual property. They came to the Rose Garden and had a huge signing ceremony. President Obama was very, this was one of his big achievements, right. The state visit by Xi. Right. All lies. We now know that shortly thereafter, they actually increased, the PLA actually increased the cyber intrusions. It is there, the same thing in Hong Kong, right? It is the CCP's action that has brought this on themselves. Okay. The world has, here's the reason. The Chinese people, particularly the diaspora, there's I think 15 million Chinese in the United States. I think there's like 5 to 7.5 million Chinese American citizens, then another 5 or 10. Wherever the Chinese go throughout the world, the Chinese are beloved, right? They're hardworking, they're entrepreneurs, they start businesses, they're great community members, they're very family oriented. So people in the United States from the time of the mission in the early 20th century, there's a great fondness and love for an affinity by the American people for the Chinese, right? Remember, we were allies in World War II. Right. It would probably have been very difficult to defeat Imperial Japan if it had not been for the Chinese, and particularly the casualties the Chinese took in fighting the Imperial Japanese Army. So we were allies. There's always been a great fondness. Everything that's occurred is because of the Chinese Communist Party and the CCP, the radical cadres that run them, that have turned China into a totalitarian surveillance state. People never envisioned this 20 years ago. Why have we actually accommodated them? So I think the free ride that they've had is over. So I don't know if there'll be a trade deal or not. I happen to think at the level of what we talked about before, which was this armistice in the economic war that was negotiated for almost 2 years, that deal, I don't see that deal getting done by 2020. The one aspect that I think the Chinese Communist Party is misplaying is that they happen to think they want anybody but Trump now. They want a Democrat. And outside of Biden, and I'll say this on the show and I've said it before, Biden will not win the Democratic primary because of China. Biden's accommodation with China, his family's financial relationship with China, his failure to release all this and have an open conversation about it, his son's financing, taking the $1.5 billion from the Bank of China and actually spending some of that money on surveillance companies to surveil the innocent Chinese people in mainland China is outrageous. But if you look at the undercurrents now, Kyle Bass, one of the biggest members of the Committee on the Present Danger, a guy I have a lot of respect for, said he would actually support Elizabeth Warren today. Today he made the announcement he would support Elizabeth Warren for the simple fact he thinks she's tougher on China than Trump. Now, I don't believe that, but my point is that now in the political marketplace in the United States, stopping the CCP is getting every day to be a bigger and bigger issue. And I think the Chinese Communist, Wang Qishan and Xi make a fundamental mistake if they believe that there's going to be some accommodation for them, because I think the American people are now very focused on exactly what's going on, and I think Hong Kong's been the thing that's done that, the event that's done that.
Okay, you said you don't know if there is going to be a trade deal in the end. I think it would be okay to not know whether we will have a trade deal in the end, but I think it's important to know whether President Trump will back down the trade talk in terms of structural changes.
I do not believe he will back down or on these aspects of the structural changes. May there be some interim thing that takes care of some tariffs, some aspect of it? I don't know about that. I think it's very unlikely, but he's clearly being forced, and the Wall Street guys, I think the economy here is growing. I think the economy here is showing strong growth. I think this has been a smart thing to do of what he's done and the way he's comported himself. Right now, the pressure on him to strike any type of deal is enormous. I think he hangs tough. I know that this is the central part of his presidency. The two things that are the two fundamentals are immigration and the wall in China. Right? Those are the two foundational elements of his presidency. This is the thing he'll be remembered for.
So the bottom line is President Trump doesn't need a trade deal for his re-election.
No, President Trump definitely does not need a trade deal for his re-election. If American people see President Trump standing up to the CCP and demanding the structural changes he wants, and also start to bring back the supply chain, some of the supply chain and manufacturing, and rebuilding our manufacturing base, that's what the American people, the people that elected him in the upper Midwest, the working class and middle class that elected him, want to see him stay the course and be strong. He promised he was going to do this. They're sophisticated people. They understand it took us 30 years to get here, 25, 30 years to get here. It's not going to be solved overnight, but President Trump has begun the solution. The central thing people look at is, remember, for 18 months, the Chinese Communist Party and the smartest guys in the room in the Chinese Communist Party negotiated what were fundamental structural changes to the Chinese economy to bring it more in line with capitalism and more in line with free markets and really more freedom for people, which it would have led to. When they realized what they had, they shut that down. That's what President Trump was trying to drive. That's why it's so important. They shut that down. And the reason they shut that down, the Chinese Communist Party can only rule as a dictatorship. If you had people why do they have the firewall, right? They treat the Chinese people as if they're too stupid to have
that's
information.
the only thing they know. That's the only way they know how to rule.
And the CCP understand that the moment they allow, not democracy could come later, the moment they allow the rule of law, they're finished. Because they're gangsters. It's a gangster, they have a mentality like triads.
So do you think the CCP can change fundamentally?
Impossible.
Okay.
It cannot change fundamentally. It's a totalitarian dictatorship. They can try to do reforms, but it'll be just like the Soviet Union. You can't reform a gangster operation.
That said, what is the ultimate goal of the economic warfare?
I think the goal of the economic warfare is to have an armistice and to stop that war and to bring it into alignment with the world's economy, with the world's version of capitalism. What happens after that is for the Chinese people. Remember, I'm absolutely adamant. The future of China is in the hands of the Chinese people. Okay. We're seeing that in Taiwan, we're seeing it in Hong Kong today. But the mainland Chinese people, ultimately what happens in China won't be dictated in Washington, won't be dictated in London, won't be dictated in Rome or Berlin or Paris or in Saudi Arabia. Okay. It's going to be the people in China are going to determine what their future is. I happen to think the future of the Chinese people ultimately is one of freedom and prosperity.
I spoke with Steve Moore last week, and he told me the Chinese leadership probably doesn't know how vulnerable the Chinese economy is because they didn't realize how much their assets is dollar denominated. He said the Chinese economy could face free fall if the U.S. take actions. Do you agree?
The only thing I disagree with is I think the Chinese Communist Party understand that very well. The Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, Wan Xishan and people like Xi are as smart as you get. It's not about they don't understand this. I think they understand it very well. I think it's become even more obvious as the days are going on. I think that's why you've had the big downturn in the Chinese economy. So I think they understand this. It is dollar denominated. They need dollars. I think it's one of the reasons that you've seen the softly talking that you've seen the last couple of days regarding Hong Kong. They understand that Hong Kong is the conduit of how they do that, how they get access to capital markets to get them dollars.
What could a currency war entail? What does that mean to the CCP?
Well, I think competitive devaluations. I don't want to, we can't. It would be very unfortunate. I don't think we should get into a currency war. It's something that we've got to be very, very, very careful about. Mm-hmm. But you're going to have to see how the CCP responds, mm-hmm. right? How the CCP, I mean, they've just been designated as a currency manipulator. Okay. Remember, and part of this, and this is the audience in China ought to understand this, is that we promised to do it on day one. President Trump, and we had a big debate inside the White House that weekend with the Secretary of Treasury back in January of 2017. President Trump, and once again trying to be the force of stability here in working with Xi, determined we'd have the meeting in Mar-a-Lago and we would delay on doing that. And he accommodated them and worked with them on this until forced to do it, a couple of weeks ago where he designated them a currency manipulator. But people should remember, 6 weeks before that, Bernie Sanders came out in his campaign and he said, the first thing I will do, the first action I will take after taking the oath of office as president is designate China as a currency manipulator. Yeah. So this situation about the currency war is one that we have to be very careful about, and I think people really have to study. And the CCP should understand that if they get into that, it could be the end of everything for them.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming by. Thank you.
Thank you.